The roguelike genre is an interesting diversion from other kinds of games. Infinitely replayable, these games have the player travel through a randomly generated world, collecting items and upgrades along the way to make each run feel unique and interesting. Owing to this simple formula, roguelikes have always been very popular and relatively easy to produce. In fact, many fans of indie games will remember a time soon after the release of The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, where roguelikes were more of a fad than a genre. At almost a weekly rate, there would be a new minimalistic art style dungeon crawling hack and slash roguelike for you to buy and play for probably like 2 hours and never touch ever again. While there were definitely a few shining examples of the formula released at this time, and even some genre-bending masterpieces that would go on to revolutionize entire gaming subcultures of their own, it became harder and harder to find a game that didn't fall through the cracks. While ultimately we have escaped this era, it's still a prominent era of the indie gaming industry. Today we'll be talking about one such game that certainly succeeds at standing out among the crowd, Risk of Rain, as well as its sequel, Risk of Rain 2. Risk of Rain was released by a very small indie company called Hopoo Games in 2013, just 1 year before The Binding of Isaac set everything off the rails. It sets itself apart from a large section of the roguelike genre by making a few simple and creative decisions in gameplay and design, giving it a distinct identity as an experience that can't be found anywhere else. I made this channel mainly to talk about game music and how it can make a game great, but for these two games I want to discuss both gameplay and music in two perspective videos, since I think Risk of Rain uses a formula that is so geniusly designed and yet so simple to understand. The player character in Risk of Rain is an employee on the UES Contact Light, which more or less is just an outer space freight train. At the start of the game, the ship is commandeered by an unfriendly character known as Providence, and crash lands on the planet below. The game then sees you exit an escape pod in a desolate area, left to fend for yourself among the planet's aggressive wildlife and using the mysterious teleporters that you find to travel to different locations. All of the items and upgrades that you pick up then are things that had been shipped by the Contact Light and scattered all around when the ship crashed. You travel across 5 different areas on the planet until you feel prepared to take a teleporter that puts you back on the Contact Light to take on Providence himself. You can repeat this 5-stage loop as many times as you like, and item effects conveniently can stack infinitely with themselves, meaning that you can pick up an unlimited amount of each item, which is pretty uncommon for roguelikes. So you can farm up those first 5 stages, but this is where the game gets interesting. As you play the game and scale in power, there's this timer in the corner of the screen that you may have noticed by now. This timer will count up for as long as you play, and it determines the difficulty of the game. Therefore, as you continue to collect stronger items and scale in power, your enemies do the same, dealing more damage and gaining more health as the timer refuses to stop counting. This makes every second a decision point. Going quickly and completing stages as fast as possible means that you stay on an easier difficulty for most of your run, but your character is weaker overall from it. While farming each area and collecting every item you can find ensures that you scale, but the game's difficulty is much higher, and there's a chance that you won't be able to grab enough items to keep up with your foes. It's a game of constantly balancing risk and reward, hence the title, Risk of Rain. What a lot of roguelikes struggle to achieve, which I've sort of touched on already, is innovation. Not every game can show perfection of the formula as Enter the Gungeon does, so it's common for a roguelike to come out that only serves to retread on old ideas that have already been pretty well established. Risk of Rain certainly doesn't pull any groundbreaking stunts that would change the genre forever. It just has a very well thought out and interactive system that makes it a clear outlier in the sea of generic roguelike games. Group that well thought out and interactive system with the appropriately rainy visual style and the sort of eclectic electronic prog rock soundtrack, and you have yourself quite an exotic feeling game that stands the test of time among games that would come out after it. I will mention, however, what with this game being about 8 years old, which is equal to 50 years when it comes to the fast evolving world of video game releases, the game's age certainly shows quite a bit. The player character is frankly tiny on the screen, especially when compared to some of the basic enemies. And for newer players, a lot of the time it's really difficult to actually tell what's going on when there are too many on the screen. These problems make the game just feel hard to get used to, and in general, kind of janky. The game is still great, and these issues could be attributed to the fact that I'm just not very good at the game, but this would all come to change over the next few years. As I mentioned earlier, the next year would see the release of The Binding of Isaac: Rebirth, and the rest is history. Isaac would be well received, spurring an era of pervasive releases of varying quality in the genre. While that story was playing out, Hopoo Games emerged from the shadows in 2019 with an early access release of Risk of Rain 2. They promised significant changes to how the game feels to play, with not many changes to the game's core systems. Only time would tell if they could live up to this promise, or if the game would ultimately fall victim to the same fate as many of those to come before, yet another bland release in the sea that the roguelike genre had since become. Short answer, no. Risk of Rain 2 delivered on all of these fronts and more. This time around you play as a crew member of the rescue ship UES Safe Travels, trying to find the contact light and any possible survivors that are still remaining on the planet. It's the same environment, the same items scattered all over the place, and that same infinite loop of increasing difficulty, with just a few twists. First of all, and this goes without saying, the game made the monumental shift from 2 to 3 dimensions, adding more depth to any positional strategy and making the game just look a little cleaner. On top of that, there are a few new characters, new items, new enemies, some new mechanics, and of course a new soundtrack, which is just as polished and effective as the first. On top of all those things, Risk of Rain 2 goes way harder on everything that the original game did. The first entry had its moments. Enemies would fill up your screen and you had to rush to higher ground before dealing with them. But Risk of Rain 2 being in 3D takes this to a new height, with quite literally an infinite number of new directions for enemies to appear from. The items in this game interact with your character in much more impactful ways, and they go a lot farther in making you overpowered when you have so many of them on that perfect run. My favorite example is from this run. I have 4 copies of an item called Purity. Purity lowers your ability cooldowns by 1 second with every stack. Now because I have 4 of them, my ability that moves me forwards has the lowest possible cooldown, meaning that I can do this. It's still the same game as the first one, underneath all of the new additions, but the elements that made it great are improved upon, while the negative aspects are nearly all but removed. Risk of Rain 2 preserves so much of what the original entry to this series had going for it while still adding its own ideas and image, just as Risk of Rain 1 did for the roguelike genre as a whole. It's always impressive to see a sequel that rises to go farther than its predecessor and tread new ground, and Risk of Rain 2 is near perfect in this way. Ultimately, the Risk of Rain series goes to show what innovation in a genre can look like. Risk of Rain 1 had a few simple ideas that really worked out for it. Infinite time and infinite difficulty, along with an infinite number of items that you can collect in a single run. This was great for a while, and then Risk of Rain 2 came out to expand and build on what was already in place. A larger 3D environment, stronger, more noticeable items that interact with each other in more interesting ways, as well as a few other mechanics like 3D printers and scrappers that give you a little bit more agency over what your character's build looks like. Instead of just taking the good ideas and kind of throwing them down again with a slightly different paint job, Risk of Rain 2 takes, for a lack of better words, more risks in its design choices. This is crucial to why the game is so well respected, and it's the kind of advancement that needs to be seen in the roguelike genre in order for it to be able to move past all of its criticisms. We've seen this happen before with Slay the Spire, a roguelike game turned RPG card battler which was popular enough to create the roguelike deck builder genre, with games like Dicey Dungeons and Monster Train to follow in its wake. And indeed, those 2 games that I just mentioned are also innovative in their own respective right, even further mutating the roguelike genre into styles of game that have never been seen before. The point is, it's easy to look at the amorphous blob of roguelike games that have come out in the last few years and despair, claiming that the genre needs new ideas and hasn't been touched in ages and it's dead and it's all hopeless and it'll never come back. But fresh and innovative ideas are still aplenty. There's those deck building roguelikes that I mentioned before. There's Metroidvania roguelikes like Dead Cells. There's roguelikes that are based on physics simulators like Noida. Space travel and vessel maintenance roguelikes like Faster Than Light. and even a first-person shooter roguelike that blends even more genres than thought to be humanly possible called Deep Rock Galactic.
Look at me, I'm Stony Rock!
And there's so much variety that it's honestly difficult to just call all of these games roguelikes and put them in the same genre anymore because of how different they look and how different they play. Risk of Rain can be seen as emblematic of this quality, the first trailblazer to push past the original ideas of the genre. On the other hand, Risk of Rain 2, with its release, opened the doors to what has been a renaissance of the roguelike genre. With any luck, developers will continue to push the style further and further forwards, and explore just how far it can be taken for years to come. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would appreciate it if you stuck around, considered subscribing and liking and all those formalities that you're supposed to do when you watch a video on YouTube. You know the drill. In the next video, I will be talking about the music from the Risk of Rain series. It'll probably be a little bit less reflective and more just a fun video where I list off everything that makes it great. The music is what really makes the game stand out to me, and most games really. Hopefully I'll be seeing you again for whenever that is up, because it will probably be soon.